Good morning. Welcome back to part 3 of our series on the lay commitment to the foundations of the common good. By way of a little recap, kind of like they do at the beginning of a TV series, previously. In week 1. Week 1, Father Matthias addressed that because of who we are, especially you as the laity, we have a responsibility to promote and protect the common good, and that we approach this responsibility of voting from a Christian perspective. And then in week 2, Deacon Josh addressed how the dignity of each and every human life is at the very foundation of the common good. That when voting, we have to remember that not all issues have the same weight. Without the right to life, no other rights matter. So if you missed either of those homilies, check them out on YouTube. Feel free to like or subscribe. Remember, this series is all about how we are supposed to form our consciences in regard to the common good, and that is why we're addressing these foundational principles. We don't have time to talk about every issue, but we address the ones that we did in these 4 weeks because they truly do form the foundation of how we have a society that upholds the common good. The common good. A question for you, something to reflect on. Do I actually believe that what God says is good is actually good? Do I believe that what God says is good is actually good? And that it's actually good for everyone? That it's good for me, it's good for you, it's good for every single person out there, even those who don't know God or don't believe in God? This question matters deeply because most people today don't. Most people today, and even probably many of us here today, don't actually believe that what God says is good for everyone. So many of us actually believe that what God says is maybe good for me, but it isn't necessarily good for you. Or it's true for me, but isn't necessarily true for you. That everything is relative. And this is never more clearly seen, I think, than in the issues we'll cover in this 3rd part of the series on marriage and the family. That marriage and the family are the foundational units, the very building blocks of society. But if we look back, ever since the sexual revolution started in the 60s, what word would you use to best describe the state of marriage in our country? Would it be confusion? The attacks on marriage and family, they've been many. Contraception, pornography, no-fault divorce, abortion, the push for the legalization of gay marriage, the transgender movement. But the common thread that underlies all of them is the same. What's good for you may be good for you, but this other thing, that's what's good for me. It's all just relative. And all of it makes for so much confusion. And then on top of that, the confusion, the relativism is covered over by endless slogans, championing freedom, individual expression, personal fulfillment, and toleration, until we get to where we are now, where everything is permitted except the truth, where everything is promoted except the good, where anything anyone says about a subject is championed except for what God says, where love is talked about so much but lived out so little. Do I really believe that what God says is good is actually good? And if so, what does God have to say about marriage and the family? After all, God himself is the author of marriage. He created the family. God is love. I think he knows what he's talking about. As the Catechism says, God who created man out of love calls him also to love. The fundamental and innate vocation of every human being, love. For man is created in the image and likeness of God, who is himself love. So what does God say about marriage and the family? I offer you 4 basic principles. First, that man and woman are created for one another. The man and woman are each created uniquely by God with equal dignity and are meant to complement each other. 2, that marriage is between one man and one woman and is meant to be faithful, fruitful, and free. 3, that children are gifts from God, people to be loved, not products to be produced or discarded. And 4th, that fatherhood and motherhood are the noblest human callings, that fathers and mothers have been entrusted with authority over and responsibility for nurturing and educating their children. I'm guessing we all agree that these are good principles, even if any of them would have gotten you canceled a few years ago. But once again, do I really believe that what God says is good is actually good for everyone? That what God says is true is actually true for everyone? Because this is the great battleground of our culture today. The truth and the goodness of marriage and the family. Of what it means to be a man, and of what it means to be a woman. Of what is actually good for our children. The family is the foundation of society. As Pope St. John Paul II said, as the family goes, so goes civilization. And right now, it doesn't look like our civilization is going in a very good direction. So what are we to do? Well, let's look at our gospel today. On the side of the road sits a blind man, Bartimaeus, and he hears that Jesus is walking by, and so he cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." And what happens? Everybody tells him to be quiet, to stay in his place, to stop making it awkward. But what is going on in Bartimaeus' heart? He knows that Jesus, the one who is goodness and truth himself, is walking by. He knows that the one that he and that all of Israel have waited for generations is walking by. And he will not be discouraged or dissuaded by those who find his outburst awkward. And so he calls out again, and Jesus hears him, and Jesus calls him. And now the disciples invite him, "Take courage, get up. Jesus is calling you." Today we need that kind of courage. There are a lot of voices telling us to be quiet, to not speak the truth, to not proclaim what God has said is good. But there's also more here. Notice Jesus' kind of odd question. What do you want me to do for you? Well, isn't it obvious? The man's blind. Duh, Jesus. He wants to be healed, right? But nowadays, we have this kind of very perplexing situation where relativism has become so common that this actually is no longer obvious, where goodness and truth have become so obscured that confusion reigns. What if Bartimaeus just wants to be affirmed in his blindness? Now that sounds silly, but this is the level of confusion that relativism has caused. To focus in on one particularly damaging lie of the gender ideology. These days, kids who are struggling with body image, depression, anxiety, instead of being helped to heal by caring and loving adults, especially their parents, instead they're being told that gender-affirming care will help them. But in reality, it will only disfigure their bodies, render them sterile for the rest of their lives, and even cause further psychological damage. And this is often done without the permission of the parents. And this is really being promoted in our country, in our state, and even in our local schools by people running for office. This is just one example of the damage done when basic truths are ignored. But relativism wreaks havoc far and wide. Consider the message told to young people who are hungry for the truth, who are hungry for deep meaning and purpose in life. What is the truth that we know? That deep, committed love in marriage, that embracing the responsibility of parenthood, that will give the greatest fulfillment, the greatest happiness. All the research shows this. Millennia of experience show this. But young people today are not being told this. They are sold a false bill of goods, that fast living, hookups, no commitments, even damaging and distorting their own bodies will somehow fill that hunger in their hearts. But it won't. Why? Because what God has said is good is actually good. God knows the deepest desires of the human heart. What do you want me to do for you? The Lord says that into the brokenness and the confusion of our world, but instead, our kids are being fed a narrative on social media and in the public schools that couldn't be farther from the true and the good. Instead of sight, they are given greater confusion. Instead of healing, they are given deeper brokenness. And no one is willing or able to tell them what is truly good. It doesn't need to be this confusing. What God has said is good is very clear. That men and women are created for one another, equal in dignity and complementarity. The marriage is between one man and one woman and is meant to be faithful, fruitful, and free. That children are gifts from God. They are people to be loved, not products to be produced or discarded. and that there is no greater calling than being a father or a mother, and no greater adventure than raising children in the faith. How different would our country look if we had people running this place who actually believed these principles, who actually believed that what God has said is good, who realize that these are the only principles that a healthy and stable society can be built upon. A society cannot be built upon relativism. It can't be built upon my feelings or your feelings, upon my opinions or your opinions. A society built on such things is a house built on sand. It will collapse. And more often than not, it will collapse into a tyranny of lies. A stable society can only be built on truth. Government has a duty to protect the family. Laws are meant to help families flourish. Parents have a right to educate and rear their children, and no authority can take that away from them. We need to elect people who will promote policies that uphold the truth and the goodness of marriage and the family, who protect the rights of parents to raise their children and to make medical and moral decisions for them, who can decide what is taught in schools, who allow parents the right to homeschool, that give parents the freedom to choose where their kids go to school. Policies that make it easier, not harder, to raise a family today. And I know the presidential candidates get all the press time, but these are issues where the local elections can have a real impact. Like who is running for a school board, deciding what our children learn or don't learn? So, as you look at all of the candidates in the election across all of the levels, here's a few questions to prayerfully consider. Which candidates will promote and protect the goods of marriage and the family as God intended them? Which candidates will most likely protect children from the lies and the confusion of gender ideology and promote the good of the family? And which candidates will promote policies that protect the rights of parents to educate and to be involved in decisions regarding their children? These are important questions. And on a deeper level, we need to be convicted that what God has said is good is actually good. And we need to stop giving ground to the lie of relativism as it continues to sow confusion. Yes, we need to do this in our elections with our vote, but we also need to do it in our daily lives, in our families, in our businesses, in our schools, in our sports teams, to be willing to boldly, charitably, and honestly speak about the goodness and truth of God's plan, of God's design for marriage and the family. If all this sounds too difficult, if you feel like you've tried and been knocked down, I want you to hear the words spoken to Bartimaeus as spoken to you today. Take courage. Get up. He is calling you.